Today, I'm going to be presenting a comparative analysis of two different international social housing projects and applying the concepts and lessons learned to our own housing crisis and future. What is affordable housing? According to the UK's definition, which has more concrete definitions on these terms and is the location of one of the projects being examined today, there are three main types of affordable housing: social housing, affordable housing, and shared ownership housing. Social housing is the most affordable option. Rent prices consider property values and local incomes to determine an affordable rate. Social housing is also sometimes known as council housing. Affordable housing can be simply understood as below market rate housing. It cannot exceed 80% of local rent values. Because it's based on the real estate market and not wages, it can still yield unaffordable housing. Shared ownership is where residents buy a share of a property and then pay a subsidized rent. It's typically cheaper than putting a down payment on a property and paying a mortgage, and it can be an affordable avenue into home ownership. But it lacks some degree of affordability because of the requirement of needing a down payment. The first case study is the failed project of Quinta, Monroy in Chile, designed by Elemental Architecture Studio. It's a social housing project consisting of 100 units. Prior to the intervention, residents took up informal living arrangements on the site, which they had been leasing from the owner in order to use the land. The housing was very poor quality, and many rooms often lacked natural light and ventilation. The residents had a lack of amenities and services, and the buildings themselves were poorly constructed out of low-quality materials. This made them prone to fire hazards. When the owner of the land died, the tenants lost their rights to the land and had to band together in order to gain official ownership from the government. It was at this point that the government began to look for solutions to reconstruct the homes without displacing any of the 100 families. Elemental's plan was to construct what they deemed half houses by focusing their work on creating kitchens and other rooms that would require servicing, while leaving the rest to be developed by the residents, saving them money. One issue with this approach is that it assumes that a freedom-based approach with little in the way of restrictive measures would produce a favorable outcome. Without restrictions in place, there's nothing stopping residents from compromising the shared spaces. This is similar to the idea that Karakusevic brought up, where there is a misguided belief that the free market will produce quality, affordable housing simply through natural competition. But as we will come to see, this is not the case. A decade later, many of the same issues plaguing the original housing conditions had resurfaced. Interviews with locals reveal that, due to locals' growing families wanting to maximize their space, people had begun encroaching onto common areas, compromising views, ventilation, and the privacy of their neighbors. Because of this tension, there is little social cohesion among the residents. Many of the same criticisms towards the rural studio can be applied to this approach of developing housing. Using surface-level theories about housing and lifestyle to engage in a project, only to then focus on the visuals and the creation of and the celebration of ideas without looking at or considering the perspectives of residents who have to live here. In fact, the situation gets even worse. When being interviewed, Elemental admitted that they had not considered any restrictions to be put in place to limit overdensification. This also relates to the issue with creating affordable housing for the poor instead of good housing for people. Though the architects aren't completely to blame, as the structures they're working within provide very little in terms of budgeting to create more desirable spaces, the point still stands that we should design with empathy and careful consideration for the lives of those living in these spaces. It is clear when looking at their later projects that they still did not learn their lessons from the failures of Quinta Monroy. When viewing the satellite photos of the site, it's clear that this newer project still suffers from the same encroached and compromised rear yards and shared spaces. The second case study is the comparatively much more successful McGrath Road housing project in London, UK, designed by Peter Barber Architects. It is an affordable housing project consisting of all three of the housing models previously mentioned, and it's made up of 26 units. The UK has a progressive legacy of council housing, dating back over 100 years. The various slum clearing initiatives, the Housing Act, which protected the quality of life, and Homes for Heroes, which massively increased the social housing stock, all contributed to the UK's position of abundant and quality social housing stock. This was, of course, until the 80s and 90s, when policies such as right to buy allowed tenants to purchase their council homes, quickly transferring all the social housing stock in the private sector. Along with this, sweeping cuts were made to the management and production of social housing during this time. Politics in London create a lot of tension that the city has to manage. Competing interests, such as the residents' desire for a more affordable and social housing, clash with the owners and developers who prefer market housing. As such, the City of London has committed to a threshold of at least 50% of all new housing units to be classed as affordable. Various issues still further contribute to housing unaffordability today in the UK. These include previously mentioned supply constraints due to market forces, rising demand from population growth and immigration, an overly restrictive approvals process that bogs down construction processes and what is able to be built, NIMBYism, and conservative measures to limit densification. Barber's approach uses an older Victorian model known as back-to-back housing, which takes advantage of shared walls in order to cut down on construction and operational costs, thus making it cheaper to rent. Barber's careful judgment is absent of the tendency to use the poor and underhoused as subjects for experimental housing models and reflects the empathy necessary to create pleasant housing. This is largely possible due to the locals' government interest and political will to provide the budget to create pleasant, affordable housing in the first place. In this way, we cannot completely fault the architects for the failure of Quinta Monroy, as their government had applied little in terms of budgeting. The sociable courtyard, strong sense of presence, and intimate porches all come together to give the project a warmth and a sense of community. Residents from Barber's projects comment on how his designs create a much more social environment than the typical apartment tower approach. One resident said, "We've been sitting out here in the evenings, singing together. It reminds me of an old East End street. I'm always seeing my neighbors." Barber also regularly visits his buildings to talk with residents and get feedback on his projects, which shows his commitment to user satisfaction.
I suppose this is at the other end of the kind of spectrum in terms of the experience of being in your home. This is very sort of has a very intimate relationship with the street. It's back of pavement terrace housing. It's got a kind of very intense relationship with the street. You're going to meet your kind of neighbours, or at least get to recognise them and know them by sight.
This approach has allowed for houses instead of flats, which is preferred. Also, every house has 3 to 4 stories, a balcony, a private terrace, a ground floor kitchen that engages with the street, and a top floor living room with views of the city. Barber's approach to housing, which emphasizes maximizing the experiences of residents as the main driving force, goes back to Goodman's discussion about respecting the poor and not just giving them the bare minimum, as was the case with Quinta Monroy. Instead, Barber uplifts the residents with a deeply thoughtful design. A similar discussion and issue is arising in Toronto, where, despite new government subsidies, a lack of sufficient funding and political action has resulted in the ongoing degradation of Toronto's affordable and social housing stock.
Trudeau was announcing $74 million to help the City of London build affordable housing. But when I asked, he wasn't saying what an affordable price is or how much prices have to come down to reach that level. What do you consider affordable? The average price in Ontario now is put at $856,000 for a home. How much does that have to come down to be affordable?
These are the things that we are addressing right now. Obviously, prices in downtown Toronto or even downtown Hamilton are going to be very different from prices in other parts of the country, but everywhere they're too high.
With Trudeau's new housing strategy to accelerate approvals process and fund the development of over 100,000 new homes, one would hope the concepts of Goodman's discussed of not mistreating the poor through striving through the bare minimum are being applied here. Housing affordability is a complex issue, but the validity of our architectural solutions don't have to be. Through using an empathetic approach to housing that considers the dignity and experiences of the residents as the central thesis to design, we can create housing that is livable and lovable. Through the comparative analysis, it is clear that not only can architecture be the root failure of housing, but also policy. Striving for better minimum standards and electing governments that have the will to fund affordable housing construction are crucial to creating space for architects to address these issues.